Goodness, and just like that, the music stops. Thank you very much. Well, welcome to the audience for this very special event on Australia's bid for COP31, why it matters and why you should care. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kathy Oak. I am the Director at the Melbourne Centre for Cities here at the University of Melbourne and an Associate Professor in Informed Cities in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. And with respect to this session tonight, for my sins, I've been to multiple COPs and I am one of the lead authors for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC's Special Report on Climate Change and Cities, which is part of the current assessment cycle. And that short report is due at early 2027. Again, thank you for joining us here at Melbourne Connect as part of Innovation Week to those in the audience. And I know that we've got quite a few attendees online as well. So welcome to everyone. I would like to first, of course, acknowledge that we're here tonight. We gather here on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. And in light of the horrendous events on the weekend, I, of course, say there is no room for racism. And also I'd like to refer to Auntie or Dr. Mandy Nicholson's layers of country, her 6 layers of country, and recognise that beneath us, Big Hewitt holds the ochre and the roots that have sustained this land for millennia. We stand on Big Dewey, where traditional owners have always balanced cultural and daily life in harmony with country. The Bunj Bik, the water that flows through every layer, has always been the lifeblood of this place, connecting us to the broader water systems that climate change now threatens globally. And tonight, as we discuss global climate talks, I acknowledge Mumukbik, the wind that carries voices and intentions and has carried traditional knowledges and wisdom for over 65,000 years. So tonight, we will be discussing Australia's bid to host COP31, COP21, 10 years ago in Paris, goodness, host COP31. It's the UN's annual climate summit, and if successful, it will bring, goodness me, not only the world leaders, but a whole tens of thousands of people from around the world for an event in Adelaide. Has been nominated as the town, if we're successful, the city, for the November 2026 event. If successful, this gathering promises to be a global showcase for Australia's green industries, major economic windfall, and potentially a huge policy opportunity or game changer, some would say, for Australia. These summits are crucial for keeping global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius under the Paris Agreement, with COP outcomes determining whether the world can avoid catastrophic climate change through coordinated action at a global level. The decision as to who will host COP31 is still up in the air. It's between Australia and Turkey. And it will be most likely announced in November at COP30 in Belém, Brazil. But of course, all of those involved would like the announcement to be made sooner for obvious logistical reasons. So COP31 does represent an unprecedented opportunity for Australia to demonstrate climate leadership alongside our Pacific partners. And so these opportunities and all of the UN sort of jargon and acronyms are going to be unpacked by this amazing panel we have today. They're going to explain the what ifs, the maybes, the potential around COPs, the opportunities for Australia's bid. And so without any further ado, although actually I do have some housekeeping notes, but I will introduce our panellists here tonight. We have Professor Jackie Peel, Redmond Barry, Distinguished Professor, Melbourne Law School, from the University of Melbourne, an IPCC coordinating lead author on Working Group 3, from not only the last assessment cycle, but recently announced for the most recent assessment cycle for the IPCC, and most importantly, a co-host and producer on Climate Talks podcast that you can listen to on all of your favourite podcast apps with myself. Sorry, shameless plug. Robin Eckersley, another Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor from the School of Social and Political Sciences here at University of Melbourne. Andrew King, ARC Future Fellow, Associate Professor in Climate Science from the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Science at Melbourne Uni. And Nabrisa Murphy, Project Officer, the Climate Reality Project Australia, New Zealand, Pacific here at University of Melbourne. That's their incredibly short profiles. Hopefully you've read their bios as part of the invitation for tonight. They have multiple and many distinguished hats and expertise, and hopefully we'll hear a lot of them tonight. We've got a short amount of time, but before we jump into the discussion, there are a few more housekeeping notes from me. Tonight's discussion is being live streamed and recorded and will be available to watch again via the Melbourne Connect's website. And may, hopefully, if the sound goes well, it will make its way to a Climate Talks podcast. And we would love to hear from the audience and also from those of you online. I believe there's a QR code on a slide coming up, so you can submit your questions online via the QR code here, or we will also have microphones for the audience to ask any questions. And a final housekeeping note to the panellists, to our speakers. Given it is about a United Nations event, there will be lots of acronyms, there will be lots of jargon, there'll be lots of lingo that not all of us are up on, even if we've been involved in this space for a long time. There's a lot of UN talk, so to say. So if you do use acronyms or use some of the UN language, if you can explain it or at least spell out the acronym first, that would be great. Whew. Right, how are we going with time? We're good, this is good. So I'm going to turn to you first, Jackie. Very, very important question to ask you. What is a COP? Why are they so important, and why is this going to be the biggest event that Australia has ever hosted?
Well, thanks, Kathy, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight to talk about this really important topic. So let's start with the acronyms.
Yes.
What is COP? And COP really just stands for Conference of the Parties, and it's a conference of the parties to the United Nations climate treaties, like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. Um, those conventions are held every year, these meetings. The first one was in 1995, held in Berlin. That was COP1. So fast forward to 2026, that will be COP, the 31st COP, and hence we talk about COP31. It's a bit strange because the date doesn't match up with the number, but that's the logic to it. Um, where these things get hosted, the default is that normally all of the COPs would be held in Bonn, which is where the Secretariat of the UN Framework Convention is based. But what's developed over time is a convention where the COP rotates between different cities across the 5 regions that the UN recognises, which is Asia, Africa, Latin America, Central and Eastern Europe, and then this weird group called Western Europe and others, which is where Australia sits. In 2026, it's going to be the Western European and others' turn to host the COP, which is why Australia bid in partnership with the Pacific for this COP. And it won't be for another 5 years until we get to have Western European and others group again eligible for the COP, which is why it's a sort of real focus at the moment. You asked why they're so large. So one of the reasons they're big is because negotiators from all the different countries that are involved in the climate treaties come. And there are now 198 countries, including the US, that are party to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So you have negotiators from all those countries around the world coming. In addition to those, you usually have world leaders. We'll have a World Leaders Summit conventionally at the start of a COP meeting. And we also have many others who come to COPs. They've become sort of part trade show, part celebration of climate.
Art circus.
Part circus. And so you have businesses, NGOs, civil society, universities, all kinds of people participating. And they're often open to the general public too in a section called the Green Zone. So the size of them has varied over time. Last year, which was held in Azerbaijan, it was about 65,000 registered delegates. The year before, it was close to 100,000. So that's kind of the size. It's a little bit like a combination, I think, of hosting the G20 and the Olympics together in terms of the size and the importance. So what that tends to mean is that it's a huge international spotlight that focuses on the host country and draws a lot of attention to what that country is doing on climate change and the leadership that it's showing in hosting and being what's called the presidency for the COP. So for Australia, it's really this very, very large event and probably one that would draw a lot of attention to climate action, climate ambition, and what Australia can contribute.
So on that point, what is the impact it could have on Australia's climate policy? And we know that we've got a very fraught relationship or a fraught, history of how we talk about climate change or how we take climate change seriously in this country. So, can't underestimate the significance of Australia hosting an event when we're constantly seemingly in a debate about whether we should or shouldn't be stronger on climate change.
Yeah, look, I think we're already seeing the effects of even just bidding for COP31. There's stuff in the news, for example, about this climate summit and what it might mean for Australia. And some of the effects of that are, for example, the government setting its new 2035 emissions reduction target at the moment. There's a little bit more interest on that, both domestically and internationally, given the bid. I think the other thing that's really important, Kathy, is that we haven't had one of these UN climate summits in our region, in the Asia Pacific region, for more than a decade. In fact, it's probably more than 15 years. this region is one of the fastest growing and has been uh, identified by the World Economic Forum as the biggest, having the biggest opportunities as regards climate action. So if you sort of think at where climate is at, it's here in this region, both in terms of the opportunities for energy transition and also, of course, the impacts that we're seeing in Australia, in the Pacific region. So it's really sort of time for the COP to be here and to talk to what our region can contribute to global climate action.
It's hard for me not to just keep going along those lines, but it'd be great to bring you in, Robin, and maybe talk a little bit about the motivation. Like, why would Australia want to host COP31, and looking at how other regions have fared or not fared with respect to hosting COPs? What are the diplomatic lessons that Australia might learn and bring into hosting COP31 if we're successful?
Well, there's a lot in that question. So I imagine quite a few in the audience are wondering why a state that is a big fossil fuel producer and exporter might put its hand up to host a COP. In fact, Australia is ranked second after Russia as the biggest fossil fuel exporter in the world, and we've seen recent approvals of major projects running out to 2070 and 2080 in relation to one metallurgical coal project. So what is the motivation of the Labor government in doing this? Well, I think first of all, we need to conceptually separate national climate performance from international diplomacy. And this is chairing a diplomatic conference. And so Australia does have good diplomatic capacity. And despite our poor record of national performance, because we're traditionally been regarded as a laggard, we form part of the umbrella group, the US, Canada, Japan, Australia and others. And of the developed world, the other major bloc is the EU, and they're traditionally much more in the leadership category relative to the umbrella group, including Australia. But we do have a diplomatic expertise, and Chris Bowen, our climate minister, has already demonstrated that over the last few years, playing quite a proactive role. So we can get a tick for that. The second question you might ask is, why have they partnered with the Pacific to do this? Because this is not just Australia hosting this alone. It's a partnership with the Pacific. And the Pacific Islands are in a different negotiating bloc. All these negotiating blocs are not to be confused with the regional UN groupings that host. So the Pacific Islands are in many different blocs. The most important is the Alliance of Small Island States, and they work with other climate vulnerable countries and regions. So Australia is signalling to the world, A, that it wants to work productively with the Pacific, and it knows it's going to be asked to do a lot by the Pacific, and it's obviously prepared to take that seriously. So this raises my eyebrows, and of course my hope that this might lift Australia's, not only see a good diplomatic performance, but also national performance. So if I think, well, what would be the motivation of the Labor government? Well, it's already been said that this is a mega conference, bigger than a Cecil B. DeMille production, that's bigger than the Olympics, would be the biggest diplomatic event on Australian soil. It can attract 30 to 40,000 delegates. So this is not just the negotiators, but the media and a range of observers, corporations, organisations from local through to international. And you have the blue zone where the negotiators are and the accredited observers, and there's lots of side events there. And you also have the green zone where there's a big, a whole lot of side events and media events and so forth. And here you have huge presence of researchers, corporations, bodies of all kinds showcasing their best practice, and also their up-to-date research from the hard science through to climate justice. So this is the place to be if you work in this space. And this is a place for Australia to boast its incredible renewable energy resources. It's a place for Australia to attract investment. It'll certainly do a lot for the South Australian economy. And although it will cost a lot to host, studies have suggested that it will actually bring back dividends that are way beyond those costs. And again, not just to the South Australian economy. It's an opportunity to bring the spotlight to Australia and put pressure. It's as if the government's putting international pressure on itself to do more. And yet, looking back, they've been quite timid, so it doesn't quite measure, the past and the future may be very different beasts. Who knows? 70% of Australians, according to a Lowy poll, are behind this happening, because I think most Australians want climate action, and this is one way of stepping up. And maybe there's a party political reason it might actually expose the anti-net zero faction inside the coalition for being totally out of touch with climate reality. So what are the lessons? Well, look, I've been to 6 COPs and I've been to the worst and the best. And I use the acronym DOG to work out what's the ingredient for a successful COP. D is good diplomacy by the conference chair. So the COP presidency is a minister or senior diplomat at the host country. O is organisation and logistics. You've got to make sure it's a city that has the capacity to host that many people, that has good transport to and from the venue, amongst the venue. For example, there's a big issue happening with the next COP host in Belém for COP30 in Brazil, where there's just not enough affordable accommodation. They're having to bring in cruise ships. Developing countries are really annoyed that the accommodation is not within their reach, and it's a huge international diplomatic incident. It could actually affect the outcome of the negotiations.
Especially if everyone gets sick from the cruise ship.
Well,
No,
that can happen. And there's also, the G stands for goodwill. And this is the behaviour of the parties themselves. And this is not something that the president can actually manage fully, but they should be able to read the tea leaves and anticipate or see when things are getting really sticky or heated and find different ways of doing this. And the best example of a COP president would be Laurent Fabius, who was the impeccable diplomat who chaired the Paris negotiations in 2015. I watched him in action. He was extraordinary. Fair, meticulous, even-minded, even-handed. He has friends of the chair doing shuttle diplomacy there were no less than 150 separate negotiations taking place at any one time. And he would read what was happening and they'd send out ways of dealing with that. So the worst was Copenhagen, where the COP president changed hands from the environment minister to the prime minister. They threw away the official negotiating text and came up with their own. It was a complete disaster, and it wasn't gavelled through. So these are the I guess the ingredients of a successful COP is to the dog, basically. Yes.
Copenhagen. I know Penny Wong was our environment minister at that moment, so I'm sure she's not entirely convinced she wants to host COP31 as a base, if she recalls Copenhagen, which I'm sure she does. We might come back to some more of the geopolitical implications, because I know you're certainly an expert in this in the discussion time. But let's, at the end of the day, we're talking about science, we're talking about climate action. So, Andrew, it's great to bring you in at this moment to talk about the science of COPs, and more importantly, do these COP outcomes or declarations or accords or whatever comes out of these COPs, do they actually translate into revised climate predictions or indeed, action?
Sometimes they do, not always. But as you highlighted at the beginning, Kathy, these COP meetings are about global collaborative action. And sometimes with these COP meetings, if enough countries make enough strong pledges, and if there's some unifying pledges made at the meeting, it can be enough to make a difference to global climate projections. We saw this in Glasgow when there were fairly significant pledges made, including on CO2 and on methane, another important greenhouse gas. And taken together, that was enough to bring the global warming scenarios, if all the pledges were followed, down below the 2 degrees Celsius global warming mark. So sometimes they can be very effective. So with Australia possibly hosting a COP meeting, there's a real chance to make a big difference to the projected global warming. Of course, with these pledges, you have to have accompanying real action as well.
Not to bring the doomsday to it all, but when we talk about climate science and the window to the opportunity to do things is seemingly closing or closed, but I have heard that 2026 is our last chance to stay on the 1.5 degrees Celsius trajectory. Can you unpack what that means, and is that the case?
So, I mean, there's never really a last chance. Of course, there's always missed opportunities, but there's always work to be done to reduce emissions and limit global warming. We're pretty certain we've already passed the point where we will go through the 1.5 degree global warming limit. We've been too slow the last decade since the Paris Agreement was reached. But that doesn't mean we should give up and say that, you know, all is lost. We know that every fraction of a degree we can reduce peak global warming, the lighter the impacts are of climate change. The Paris Agreement is also really referring to end of 21st century global warming levels. So there is the possibility, if we're able to achieve net zero emissions and even go a bit beyond net zero emissions, that we might be able to start cooling the planet back down again. We know that ultimately that's what we're going to need to do. So the science is really quite simple. We know that the more greenhouse gas we emit, the more we warm the planet. CO2 is the primary cause of our global warming, and it's actually roughly a linear relationship. And if we can achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions or net zero CO2 emissions globally, we should be able to halt global warming beyond that point. If we can go a bit further, actually achieve net negative emissions, we can start cooling the planet back down. We've already missed the opportunity to limit peak global warming below 1.5 degrees. So we're going to need to work harder to reduce our emissions more quickly from now, and we're going to need to achieve net negative emissions ultimately.
If you'd like Andrew to explain any more of all of that, get your questions ready for the discussion, because you know, there's a lot in well, the way you've articulated it then, that 1.5 and emissions and how do we actually get there. There's a lot of intricate knowledge that I'm sure you can share more in the discussion. But in particular, we're talking about action, and COP31 is being billed as the implementation COP. It's the moment to really demonstrate this action, demonstrate what we're talking about with respect to net zero. So it is, again, also a great opportunity, if it's in our region, for Australia and all of the sectors that are working on you know, on solutions and around mitigation and adaptation to climate change, to bring them to the fore and showcase what we can actually do to halt emissions. Importantly, and we definitely didn't mean to have you last, but obviously the voice of young people, the voice of the Pacific, is something Nabri said that you're particularly working on through the Climate Reality Project. So from your perspective, how do we ensure that young climate leaders from Australia, from New Zealand, from the Pacific are having their voices heard at COP31? Yeah, particularly if the format is smaller than some of the others, if Adelaide can't host the 65,000 that we've seen in the past, if it is a slightly smaller COP, what does that mean also for, you know, equal access and making sure that all the voices are heard?
Yeah, thank you. And I do want to preface my answers by saying that while I work with the Pacific, young people, I am no longer young, but I'm also not a Pacific Islander, but I am an islander. I'm from the Maldives, so my responses, though, I've reflects what I've been hearing and learning from the young people in the Pacific, and I encourage everyone to reach out to, you know, the Pacific are very vocal in what they're asking for, so my answers reflect what I've heard and learned from them. And it is quite scary. I don't know if anyone else noticed this, hearing, you know, Andrew say that we've, you know, that it's too late to maintain 1.5, because in the Pacific, the phrase is 1.5 to stay alive, right? And they, like, one of the strongest calls to action that I've been hearing a lot is, what's it called? Oh, we are not drowning, we're fighting. So this is a really, like, Australia hosting COP31 in partnership with the Pacific is a really good opportunity to, you know, to highlight that fact and to really implement. The implementation COP it's a matter of life or death for a lot of people. So Sorry. So let's go with, so what does meaningful partnership look like? Because we all recognize that a COP presidency can only be held by one country. So Australia's bid to host, but in partnership with the Pacific. So what does that look like? What does meaningful participation and partnership look like for young people in the region? And so based on what Pacific civil society have been demanding as well, the climate justice demands, I've come up with 6 things that I'm quickly gonna suggest as things that would really ensure that youth, going back to what Jackie said as well, this is the biggest region, the largest group of young people live in this region, and also the largest amounts of different climate impacts are communities in the region are affected by very diverse climate impacts, everything from drought to tsunamis to, cyclones. So there's a real opportunity for Australia to work with the current and future leaders, and really make sure that they're not just included, but maybe even co-creators of climate justice outcomes in COP31 if we host it. So number 1 is institutionalizing youth co-leadership. So this could look like creating a Pacific Australian youth climate delegation that's officially recognized as part of the host country's leadership structure. So, not just observers or side event participants, or not having just a youth day, but being integrated and institutionalized within the leadership structure of the host country. And number 2 would be guaranteeing access through funding. The Pacific in particular have been very vocal with the fact that it's, they need grants, not loans, and making sure the funding flows to those who are most impacted to enable their meaningful participation in negotiations. So this could look like, I was thinking, establishing a youth participation fund potentially, which is resourced by government and by philanthropy and universities. So that for that to adequately cover travel, accommodation, as we've mentioned, even things like translation services, and ensuring access to rural and remote Australians, young people in Aotearoa, and maritime zones in the Pacific. So ensuring inclusivity and accessibility for everyone through these funds that are again institutionalized in the O part of the dog, the operational. And then number 3 would be distributed voices. So considering the fact that if it is in Adelaide, if it's a smaller, space, smaller capacity, why not think about pairing the Adelaide event with regional hubs where young people, say for instance in Fiji, in Vanuatu, in Auckland, in Darwin, distributed kind of, decentralizing basically. And with technology now, like we're doing with this, it could be live streamed into COP sessions and decision rooms, and digital participation can go a long way. And I feel like this is again an opportunity to ensure meaningful participation. The 4th one is youth-led knowledge and storytelling platforms. So again, ensuring that those who are most impacted, but also have a lot of expertise and solutions, and that they don't always get a chance to voice. So we could have dedicated COP spaces for Pacific and First Nations storytelling through talanoas, through art, through huis, digital media hubs, like really centering lived experience and Indigenous knowledge systems, and not just prioritizing technocratic negotiations only. So it goes hand in hand, right? And it is crucial for sustainable and effective action and implementation. Number 5, I'm almost done. Accountability. So accountability mechanisms could be designed by youth as part of it, right? So again, I was thinking about what this could look like, and it could be things like a youth accountability council that produces, say, daily scorecards on government commitments, and then that could be fed directly to media briefings and plenary reports and things. And the 6th one is intergenerational mentorship. So formalizing mentorships between experienced or almost veteran negotiators, Pacific elders, Indigenous elders, and emerging or current youth leadership. And just really that intergenerational knowledge exchange and, exchange of expertise, learning from each other, but also building a pipeline of people who are, who can step into I can't read my own writing, formal roles at future COPs. So yeah, and that's about collective power sharing and intergenerational justice. So yeah, I feel like my wish list is that this could be the first COP that ensures youth are not tokenized, but co-lead the process from everything from finance to logistics to agenda setting to accountability. And actually having a smaller setting could help redistribute some of that power and and decentralize, and distributed community action could be, one of the things that Australia does to be a leader in this space. I'll stop there.
I feel like that list needs a clap, really, to be honest. It's not only a clap, but I mean, it makes sense to me. Yeah, if it was listed on our poll everywhere. You can upvote or downvote the questions on here, but I feel if that was on there, we'd put a lot of upvotes. But I think that's a great, it's even the way you articulate it, framing like how we should, or how different groups are advocating to the Australian government who are in the, they put forward, they started putting this bid together in 2022, my understanding. And so, they're obviously receiving a lot of perspectives from all the different interested parties about how or why or what they should do around COP31 if they're successful. And this seems like the list that should go to the top of their pile about how they could make it a different COP. Thank you for responding to those, multifaceted questions. I thought I'd give you an opportunity if you wanted to respond to either something that someone else has said or to add to one of the remarks that you've already made. But yeah, and we'll start with Jackie and then move along the panel, and then we will open it up to questions online and also from the audience as well. But yeah, Jackie.
So I was just reflecting on Robin's DOG and the importance of the O organisation, which also goes to your points, Nabriza, about what a good COP would look like. Can we achieve that if the runway into COP is perhaps only 12 months? There is incredible engagement going across the Australian community, different groups, universities, businesses, NGOs, environmental groups, youth, and the Pacific. But if there's not the organisational runway, it might be quite a difficult task to achieve. And I think one of the other concerns people have had is just how small Adelaide is as a host city. Some WAGs have done a sort of calculation of number of hotel beds in Adelaide, and it sure doesn't add up to 65,000.
Apparently it's going to be the Airbnb COP.
The Airbnb COP may be coming our way. But I think, Nabriza, your point that a decentralised version of COP is the way to go, that in fact this COP is one that shouldn't just be embraced by the host city of Adelaide, but all Australian cities and regions and our Pacific neighbours, and there is a capacity to host and do COPs differently. And I think if Australia could demonstrate that, that would indeed be a really big change and success, because one of the criticisms of COPs over time is they're big, they're cumbersome, they don't seem to change the dial, shift the needle too much in terms of what the science is telling us to do. But yet they're a really important forum for all these countries around the world to come together, to look each other in the eye, whether you're a small island state or the US, and hold each other to account, and for the public to hold people to account. So it's a huge opportunity. How do we make the best of it? I think there's some great ideas across the panel, but that O in the DOG I think is going to be critical.
I'd just like to say a little bit more about the D. If you look back to Paris, Laurence Toubiana, who was the climate change ambassador for France, who assisted the COP president, she made no less than 45 overseas trips in the 18 months leading up to Paris to talk with senior negotiators over sticking points to help smooth the path. The other thing about the COP presidency is not only do they need a long runway with a lot of shuttle diplomacy, bilateral, regional and so forth, they need to follow up for the succeeding year to pass the baton on to the next COP. So how well Australia manages it depends a lot on how well Belém, Brazil, manages it. The other point I wanted to make about diplomacy is that just the very process of putting in a bid for COP31 has got important geopolitical implications for Australia, for the US, for its relationship with the US, China, the EU, and the world. Vis-a-vis the US, it's distancing itself from the Trump administration, as one would want to do, quite significantly. Vis-a-vis China, it's laying stake to its neighbourhood in the way that China does, but not in the same way in the South China Sea. But China's obviously exerting more influence in the region, so Australia's stepping up its aid and development assistance, and climate change is an essential prong, an increasingly important prong in Australia's relationship with the Pacific. And the more that it aligns with the Pacific, the more it will be prodded to do more, because they are in different negotiating groups. They're not in like-minded negotiating groups over the history of the 30-odd years of negotiations. So this will pull Australia closer to the Pacific, and in so doing, will pull it closer to the EU as its preferred like-minded partner, if it walks the walk here. So I think they're really important geopolitical developments. It's just one issue area of diplomacy, but I think it's a significant one that's seeing this kind of a realignment of who your friends, enemies, and partners are.
Andrew.
I was reflecting on Nabrisa's comments as well, and thinking about how we're in a region really feeling the impacts of climate change, and particularly when we think about small island states, really, really vulnerable to climate change impacts, particularly through sea level rise. And I think there is an opportunity with this COP, with incorporating Pacific voices, young people's voices, to really, I mean, these are the people who will experience the biggest impacts of climate change. We know that over the next 50, 60 years, sea level will continue to rise, and that many of these island states will suffer big impacts. And making sure that these people are really part of an integral, central part of the COP process, I think should, you would hope, mean that we have stronger action. It's very hard to, I think Jackie was talking about looking people in the eye. You know, these are the people who will experience the biggest impacts of climate change this, the next decades. So hopefully that really should help to motivate more action.
Risa.
True, and along that same line, just thinking, I guess, again, something, we did a challenge with some of the Pacific young people recently around climate resilience, and there was a day where everyone was learning about what their ancestors had done, or, like the learning from previous traditional knowledge systems and indigenous knowledge systems. And one of them had said, when you think about it, we are the ancestors that our future generations will learn from. So being, thinking about that accountability too, because it's not just about government accountability and policy, but also like that intergenerational, like what do we want to leave behind? How do we want to embody these principles that we talk about? Yeah.
The legacy question you ask is a great prompt for the question we'll ask you at the end. So start to think about it in terms of what is a successful COP, and we will ask the audience to I don't think it's this QR code, but there'll be an opportunity to let us know what you think the legacy should be from COP31 at the end. But before we get to that prompt, we would like to now open it up for questions. I'm busy scanning the questions online here. For those in the room, you can obviously ask your question online if you'd prefer not to use the microphone. But if you would like to use the microphone, we have multiple Melbourne Connect crew with microphones, and we ask that you wait to ask your question with the microphone in hand, and speak clearly into the microphone, because we do have people online and we're recording it. We ask that you keep your questions to questions and brief, and if possible, you can direct it to one person rather than the whole panel, just so that we can get to as many questions as possible, although of course to the panel, if multiple people want to answer it, I'm not going to get in the way too much between me and the clock. And then I will also look online there are thumbs up and thumbs down. So I will try and prioritise the most important question from those looking online. Well, to that point, I've been looking at them online, and there are a lot of questions here. And I haven't had that question myself, and I've been on a similar panel like this and hadn't had those questions. But there are quite a few questions online about, what credibility does Australia have in hosting the COP31? There's obviously mentions in here around, obviously we've got algal blooms in South Australia, we've got the most recent international court advisory opinion, and I know that Jackie can tell us more about that and what does that mean for Australia. And also, we are a petro state, as Robin mentioned at the start as well. So why should we be even thinking that we should host a COP? So I assume a few of us might want to answer that question to start off with, but hopefully I did justice to those who asked those questions in pulling them all together. Why should we even host it if we don't have necessarily the climate credentials?
I'll jump in
Go
there if
for
I
it.
may. Well, we shall have to build those credentials quite quickly. Australia doesn't have a strategy for a just and orderly transition away from fossil fuels. Even though Chris Bowen did sign the International Just Transition Declaration a few years ago, and even though we've aligned ourselves with the Pacific and its demands along those lines. So I think the first step is a series of bilateral negotiations with our major fossil fuel markets. Because, as Jackie will probably elaborate on more, the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion, which of course was thanks to the efforts of Pacific Island law students from Vanuatu, has made it quite clear that it's an international legal wrong, or it may be, if you don't try and align your targets with 1.5, which requires regulating fossil fuels, including exports, including reducing subsidies and no longer licensing new projects. So this is huge. And so to do that, we need a just transition nationally and globally, but we also need to communicate with our markets, because Japan, wants Australia to continue to sell this stuff. South Korea, China, India to some extent. And it must begin with those bilateral negotiations so we don't leave them high and dry. They need to start working in lockstep with Australia to move away from that. And then you can start building a credible just transition plan. But we can easily do this locally. At the moment, where our ageing coal fleet is dying and it's being replaced by renewable in the grid, and that's one of the success stories. But these are all market decisions by private operators. The government's not leading this with a just and orderly phase out. It's not saying when it should happen, it's just responding. It's doing some measures in the regions that are consistent with just transition under the Net Economic Authority, the Net Zero Economic Authority, investing in the regions to assist workers in coal mines. And yet it won't use the word. It assiduously avoids it. And that's a puzzle. It's going to have to start doing that. It's going to have to start using that language, because without a just and orderly and fair transition, you won't be able to build the political legitimacy for this transition, and the whole thing will fall over. And we've seen this in the past. We don't want that to happen again.
Jackie, I'm sure you'd like to jump in here.
Well, I'm just sort of reflecting on it. Absolutely, I don't disagree with anything Robin has said about our poor record of climate policy generally, but there are other reasons why Australia might be a good COP host. It's one of the world's diminishing number of democracies, has a very strong civil society that will make a lot of noise and excitement about a COP. The Pacific engagement is really the sort of moral voice sitting on the shoulder of the Australian government if we're hosting COP31, really pushing towards a different kind of climate bargain that we might reach. And I think there is something in the argument that our Minister Chris Bowen often makes, that to speak to other fossil fuel producers and countries that are big consumers of fossil fuels, maybe there's some kind of legitimacy in also having the same set of problems. So one of the key things that we're trying to push forward coming out of past COPs is the idea that countries have agreed to transition away from fossil fuels in their energy systems, and it was Australian negotiators who got that language particularly into the decision at COP28, in Dubai. So how do they put the action behind that? I think countries that experience that dilemma of being both big fossil fuel producers and consumers probably this is top of mind in terms of policy, in terms of how you transition away. So there is something. There's strength in the criticism that Australia is yet another petrostate hosting a COP. We've had a succession of them now, not all of them in great democracies, I would say, with great civil society access that Australia would have. But also there is this point that maybe this is really a big challenge in Australia, and so if we can show leadership to lead the way out of that, maybe that's a pathway that others can follow.
I'm trying to see through the lights over there. Is there someone with a microphone and a person who'd like to speak into or ask a question into it? Anyone with a microphone to raise their hand to let us know? Oh, over here. Okay, so is it? Oh, great. Here we go. Thank you.
Thank you all. My question is to Robin. To what extent, and this sort of is related to the previous question, but it is different, to what extent does Australia's ongoing exporting of fossil fuels and the obvious point that Australia wants to be Pacific Islands' preferred security partner affect the likelihood of Pacific Islands agreeing to co-host? So I guess that's the different angle. Why would Pacific Islands agree to co-host with Australia?
That's a great question. I've asked myself that many times. A lot has to do with the way Australia structures the managing of the COP. You can only have one COP president. You can't rotate, but it's very important that Australia give senior diplomats in the region a very significant role so that the COP works for them, so they get outcomes that really make them better off than they would otherwise have been for the exercise. In many ways, they've got the Trump hand, and I think Jackie put her finger on it. They've got the moral authority, and it reminds me of the closing week of the Paris negotiations, the second week where this high ambition coalition emerged from the wings, insisting on 1.5. That was led by Tony de Bruym, the foreign minister of the Marshall Islands, and he hitched himself to the EU with their diplomatic capacity to build this, and the US joined and others joined. And this moral snowball grew, and it got into the agreement. But at the signing ceremony, when Australia wanted to join this, they sort of said, well, you've got to put your credentials on the table, and we can't see any. So they pretty much snubbed them. So they've done that before, and they could do that again. And this is a risk for Australia. And this is what makes it so intriguing for me. They've submitted themselves to that risk. They see this as an opportunity, and maybe they're leveraging the COP hosting to kind of give them, to help put the sails in their wind, the wind in their sails, because the international negotiations are in the doldrums. They're in the worst place I've seen them since Paris Agreement, particularly with Trump actively using his tariff diplomacy to insist on people buying America's fossil fuels and so forth. So we're in a bad place. It's a really big challenge, diplomatic challenge, and it's got to be agreed by consensus. So Australia knows that we have to get OPEC on board, and not just the Pacific Islands, but also OPEC. How do you reach a compromise between those two groups? This is the diplomatic challenge. And I think the Pacific Islands recognise that this is not a cakewalk. So it's not like they're going to walk away when, the diplomacy has to happen and has to be transparent and fair, and everyone needs to be heard from, how do you help Nigeria move away from oil with a huge amount of poverty and a rapidly growing population? These are tricky political questions, and just occupying the moral high ground is not that helpful. So maybe there's something in the fact that we're fossil fuel producers and we know how hard it is, and that will give us an ability to talk to those in similar positions while constantly bending to hear the Pacific's, putting our ear to the Pacific all the way through. This could be the basis of creative compromise, and it could maybe put a bit of wind in the sails of these sagging negotiations.
I might pull another couple of questions together and maybe go to Andrew and Nabrisa at the end to talk about the role of others not in Australia, like other voices and other perspectives in not only helping to win the bid as a question, like how can others, or the question is around how do day-to-day Australians help, but I could include in that? How do other voices, whether it's youth or scientists or universities or other civil society groups as they're called, how can they help Australia with the bid? But then once we have the bid, how can other voices and perspectives get involved in a process like a COP? So maybe I'll start with Nabrisa, and then Andrew can come in, talk about how scientists you get involved in these things.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I guess we could start with so currently, as Jackie mentioned, we're still waiting for Australia to. So the first, if we think of actionable things, right? The first thing is we're waiting for Australia to announce their next NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, which are about emissions reductions. So this, there's a lot of petitions going around, or there's a lot of different ways to engage with government at the minute to, for instance, the Climate Council have a petition going to really push the government to commit to a really ambitious emissions reduction target. And if we are if Australia wants to win the bid, they have to walk the talk, right? We have to, like, these NDC announcements have to be taken seriously and have to show commitment to emissions reductions that can then be held accountable during COP negotiations and during the lead up to decisions around COP and operationalizing COP. So I might do a little plug for Climate Reality Project, because we're also about to, we are engaging with the general public, but also through our Climate Reality leaders, which we have about 2,500 across Australia, Aotearoa, and the Pacific. We are continuing, so we have a series of webinars that Melbourne Climate Futures are helping co-host as well, where we focus on different aspects of COP-related topics, and we have speakers that come and talk about why this is important and what the audience can do, what actions we can do within our circles of commitment or our circles of influence. So one way for every person to be able to, and others to be able to engage, is joining things like webinars there's a lot going on. We're also working with people to hold community climate conversations, and we provide resources around, just really simple ways to have a conversation within your workplace or within your community to then move the dial in any way we can. Basically, it's about any small action matters, because, for instance, if we write to our MPs, someone in the office has to read that letter, and the number of signatures or the number of letters that go through then show the level of, interest and passion and commitment that the general public have. So I don't know if that answers the question, but feel free to reach out to us, or because we are doing a lot to try and engage with people and bring together the region so that we can have unified action towards holding Australia accountable to, yeah.
Well, I think it's a good point you make, because I read overnight that Christiana Figueres, who is the former executive secretary of the UNFCCC and was very involved in Paris, she said, well, if Australia wants to win the bid, then they need to up their targets within their NDC. So, Andrew, I don't know if you want to talk about your community of practice or scientists. How do you mobilise either before or during these COPs?
Well, I think scientists, obviously establishing the basis for the need for reducing emissions, but also showing the benefits of those lower emissions pathways and what we can achieve through stronger pledges and policies that back them up. I think as well, for scientists, we can play a role through making submissions so that we make sure that when the government is establishing the new NDC, the NDCs for 2030 and 2035, that they're really science-based. And there's a lot of us have been doing that recently. Just making sure that the science really is informing every decision that's being made, and that all the decisions that are being made are in light of the fact that the more we emit, the more we warm the planet.
Indeed. So I believe we've got one question here in the audience, and we're probably looking at the clock.
Hi there. I think it's a question for Andrew. Do you think that the creation of or identification of a net zero target was a bad strategy because the shape of the emissions reduction graph between now and 2050 is probably even more important? We can picture many different emission graphs shapes between here and then, and that's the target has allowed the governments to get away from the hard discussions that we should be having now.
That's a really good question. So maybe just briefly, I've mentioned net zero without really explaining it, so I'll maybe explain it briefly as well first. So at the moment, we're emitting far more carbon than we're taking up from the atmosphere. Net zero is about kind of achieving a balance where the amount that we emit, we balance with uptake of carbon. So to get to net zero, we need to reduce our emissions, and we need to learn how to take up more carbon from the atmosphere. So we definitely need to achieve net zero emissions to get to halting further global warming. We believe that around the point of achieving global net zero, that would be around the point the world stops further warming. So it is an important target, but the pathway does matter as well. I think that was really your main point, that we shouldn't be delaying action. 2050 might seem quite far away. It's not really that far away, actually. We need to change how society functions to get to net zero. But it does seem like 2050 seems sufficiently far away that governments can keep kicking the ball further and further away. But actually, there needs to be really strong action consistently if we're going to have a chance of achieving net zero. So I think there has been a bit of a risk with that 2050 target, and it's up to scientists, it's up to all of us, I think, to remind the government that we need to be making emissions reductions. We need to be committing to strong emissions reductions over the next 5 years, the next 10 years, and not just thinking about 25 years' time.
Thank you. Now, looking at the clock, I'm really sorry that we have run out of time to ask any more questions in the audience, but we are going to ask you to answer the question around what would a successfully hosted COP look like, and maybe you can get some of your question into that response, maybe. So while that poll is up on the slide for you to use your phones to get to the QR code and answer that question, and we'll display a word cloud, I believe, in a moment on the screen to snapshot what the audience thinks a successful COP would look like. So while you're answering that, I'm going to ask our fabulous panel to also answer that question to close out this very rapid run through what a successful COP31 bid would look like for Australia. So let's start with you, Jackie. What would a successfully hosted COP look like from your perspective?
Well, because I'm a lawyer, I'm not going to give you one answer. I'm going to give you three, which is I think we need to look at it at three different levels. One is the international level, what COP could deliver for the world. The domestic level, what it could deliver for Australia, and the regional level, what it could deliver in the region. And we've talked about all of those different ones. So instead, for Australia, I hope the legacy is that we have a better public understanding of climate change and the importance of climate action, that we finally put the climate wars in the rearview mirror and we don't have to have those debates anymore. Instead, we're committed to climate action. We understand its importance. That's what I'd hope for Australia hosting the COP. For the region, undoubtedly, the key issue is financial help, capacity building for our Pacific neighbours. They're consistent in saying that climate change is the issue for them in international diplomacy. So that is their measure of success. And for the world, I think we really need to put action behind the words. There's been lots of great words in the COP declarations over time, but particularly that idea of transitioning away from fossil fuels. It was only in COP28 in 2023 that we saw fossil fuels make an appearance in the language used in COP. So I think we absolutely need to put action behind that because we know it's essential for a climate-safe future.
Robin.
In addition to what Jackie has dreamed up, I would like Australia to, well, firstly, just backtrack a little bit. The global stocktake that happened in COP28 called on all governments to align their NDCs with 1.5 degrees. And a report's just dropped in my inbox in the last few days from Climate Analytics, and it said for Australia to align its target with 1.5 degrees, we need to increase our existing one from 43 to 72%, and our new one, our NDC, that's nationally determined contribution for 2035, to 81%. Now, there's a big push for Australians for 75%. We see business groups and sporting figures. Just in today's age, there was a big ad saying, but this was the minimum scientific floor below which we should not fall, and obviously they would be supportive of higher action. And progressive business recognises that decarbonisation is good for business and failure to act is shocking for business and increasingly over time. So I think I would like to see clear movement on the just transition dialogue in addition to that. And ultimately, the most important thing is the mobilisation of climate finance, because the vast majority of developing countries are dependent upon climate finance to mitigate and adapt. And many have made receipt of sufficient climate finance conditional on acting. So without mobilising the necessary finance, we're cooked.
Andrew.
Well, I think I'm really echoing a lot of what Jackie and Robin said. Really much stronger pledges backed up by strong policy and action is definitely what we need, not only in terms of emissions reduction, but as Robin was saying, supporting climate adaptation in the region. Expansion of the loss and damage fund is something we really, really need to see, with acknowledgement that countries like Australia are the primary cause of a lot of these problems, and we should be paying for this adaptation, paying so that the countries suffering the biggest impacts are not left with the financial burden as well. So I'm not all that optimistic, but I really would hope that if COP if the COP is in Australia with the Pacific voices really integrated, that we should see the moral imperative to act being much more obvious.
Nabrisa.
So yeah, similarly, I think finance flowing directly to communities and not just institutions. Decisions shared across Indigenous, feminist, youth, and grassroots groups. Knowledge systems valued equally alongside Western science. They go together, and we need to start recognizing it. Accountability rooted in lived experience, and feminist and intersectional COP processes. Yeah, those are the points I made. So I'll stop. Just ensuring inclusivity basically would be
Absolutely. Well, it's been really difficult as moderator not to interject and have my opinion, but I will close it there without talking about cities too much. But thank you so much to our panellists. Before I do formally call for a round of applause, thank you for filling in the word cloud. If you have another moment to provide some feedback on the event, there will be a post-event survey. I believe another QR code will come up on the screen to give us, any further, some feedback on the tonight's event. But yeah, thank you so much to Jackie and Robin and Andrew and Nabrisa for this fabulous session here at Melbourne Connect. Thank you to obviously Melbourne Connect and the University of Melbourne alumni group for bringing us together. I think it's been an excellent session and I hope you all agree. So please, round of applause for our panellists. Yes. And yeah, have a great evening.